Well, good evening, and welcome to the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies here at Elizabethtown College. I'm Steve Nault, Interim Director of the Young Center, and so glad that all of you can join us here this evening, those of you here in Booker Meeting House and those of you joining us from across the country via Zoom. With support from Elizabethtown College, the Young Center fosters and promotes the study of Anabaptist and Pietist groups and traditions in their varied expressions across time and place. And this evening, we're considering the ways that global migration and the ways that we talk about such movement shapes the way we understand ourselves, time, space, even reality itself. And we do so by welcoming Dr. John Eicher, recipient of this year's Dale W. Brown Book Award for Outstanding Scholarship in Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. In 2004, the Young Center established an annual award to recognize and promote recent scholarship that makes substantial new contributions to Anabaptist or Pietist studies. The award also honors the significant contribution of Dale Brown, longtime Church of the Brethren theologian, historian, and peace activist, and known to some of us here. Dale Brown was a professor at Bethany Theological Seminary from 1962 to 1994, after which he and his wife Lois retired here to Elizabethtown. And friends of Dale and Lois graciously funded the award that we are recognizing this evening. Would note that Dale passed away in late August of this year at age 95. He was living in the greater Chicago area. But with the Dale W. Brown Book Award, we recognize and remember and honor his work for extending scholarship for the church in Anabaptist and Pietist studies. And this evening, we also honor John Eicher with that award for his book, Exiled Among Nations, German and Mennonite Mythologies in a Transnational Age, published last year by Cambridge University Press. John Eicher is an assistant professor of history at Penn State University-Altoona. He received degrees from Goshen College and the University of Iowa, and visiting fellowships from the Free University of Berlin, the University of Freiburg, and the German Historical Association in Washington, D.C. Before we hear from Dr. Eicher this evening, I want to let our live stream audience know that they can submit questions via the Q&A feature, and as time permits, we'll take up those questions in our question and discussion time to follow. Oh, welcome, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for that kind introduction. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the Young Center for this award. I'm very glad to be here today. I'm going to be talking about my book manuscript, which is outside for sale, if you're interested. Hopefully I can convince you to buy it. But I'm going to be talking about the book that I won this award for. And I'm going to go through the narrative of the book, and then I'm going to explain how I understood that narrative and what I interpreted from it, and some of the broader implications of the finding for things like refugees, refugee studies, German history, and history itself. So to back up just a little bit, I'm sure most of you know who the Mennonites are, but just to give a little bit of a background, Mennonites, a small religious group that emerged from the 16th century Anabaptist movement with the tenets of complete separation of church and state, biblical nonviolence, and the absence of a church hierarchy. And these ideas were deeply unpopular with governments across Europe. And so the Mennonites were forced to flee. The Anabaptists, as they were then known, were forced to flee to different places, some coming here to Pennsylvania, others going to Russia and settling there in the early 19th century. Now, the first group of Mennonites that I'm talking about here are shown in black, the black lines on this map. And they're voluntary migrants. They left Russia for Canada in the 1870s and then departed Canada for Paraguay in the 1920s. And they numbered about 2,000 individuals. They created the Menno Colony in Paraguay. And it's located in what's called the Grand Chaco, which is right here in central South America. It's a sort of vast, flat plain. It's kind of like maybe the Texas Panhandle, the way the landscape is. And they were voluntary migrants. They chose to move. They weren't compelled to move. They chose to move. And their main interest was rejecting all kinds of outside attachments. They wanted to be isolated. The second group in white is composed of refugees. And unlike the Menno Colony, this group wanted to create many connections with many outside organizations. And this group remained in Russia until 1929, when Joseph Stalin, right, Stalinist persecution forced them to flee to Germany and to China also, and thence to Paraguay. And this group created the Fahrenheim Colony with a population of 2,000. And they variously wished to belong to the Nazi Party, support the Paraguayans during the Chaco War, which was waged between Paraguay and Bolivia from 1932 to 1935. And they also wanted to proselytize their faith to indigenous people in the Chaco. So black is the Menno Colony, white is the Fahrenheim Colony. Black are the voluntary migrants, white are the refugees. So they're settled next to each other, and they literally are next to each other. They're within like 10 kilometers of each other. So they're next door neighbors in the middle of this sort of vast open plain. But for the first 15 years of their settlement, they don't have any real interaction with each other. They had little interest in helping each other or even communicating with each other. So the question I pose is, how did this happen? Why did these two groups with similar origins, religion, language, culture, some were even related by blood, have such widely different understandings of their nationality, as ostensibly as Germans, and their religion, their Germanness and their Mennoniteness, if you want to call it that? More broadly, what do the movements of these migrants and refugees tell us about governments and the formation of nation states during an era of high nationalism? And the high nationalist era is about from 1850 to 1950, when a lot of people are organizing in big ways to create nation states in Europe and then eventually other parts of the world. So I'll now move on to the arguments that I present in the book, the points that I make in the book. The first is that between the 1870 and 1945, Russia's Mennonites used the global spread of nationalism and Christian ecumenicism. What I mean by that is Christians helping each other. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. And I'll also bend it out a little bit more because I want to point. Okay. They used it to aid their movements by assuming and abandoning national and religious identifications. And what I mean by that is these Mennonites have a lot of different ways they can identify themselves. We're farmers, we're Christian, we're Mennonite specifically, we're German, Dutch, whatever. And so they're using different identifications to talk to different outside groups. And it's helping them move around. They also interpreted their movements by appropriating and adapting national and religious myths. And what that is to say is they live inside stories that they're creating themselves. And so they might latch on to certain myths, maybe, and by myth, I don't mean false, I mean story. A myth maybe from the Bible, or the myth of Germans as good farmers. And they're interpreting their movements by using these stories. Simultaneously, and that's the groups themselves. But at the same time, we have governments, and they're doing things too, in relief organizations, like the MCC, for instance. And they are seeking to monopolize and homogenize those identifications. Because you have a lot of little groups, and they all think Mennonite means something different, or being German means something different. But the German government thinks there's something specific about being German, and they want to say what it is, or the MCC does, and so forth. And also, governments and relief organizations use migrants for their own purposes by portraying them as enemies or heroes in their national and religious mythology. Right? these German refugees. They're so, they've been kicked out by Russia. They're so poor, let's help them. They're Germans like us. And so they're using migrants and refugees for a rhetorical purpose, to make a point about who they are as a nation or an organization. So now I'm going to describe my project. Oh, I'm sorry, I have one more point. There it is. Okay, I'm sorry. All right. Okay. I'm now going to describe my project, demonstrating how Mennonites deployed their national and religious identifications in different contexts. And after that, I'm going to describe my methodology, which explains why they held contrasting interpretations of their movement. So first I'm going to show what happened, then I'm going to explain why it happened that way. So in the 1870s, there are about 60,000 Mennonites living in Russia. And they get into this problem with the Russian government. The Russian government wants to be able to understand this huge population that it's administering. It's starting to nationalize. It wants to create a nation. And to do that, they want a few things. They want public education. They want to standardize the Russian language. They want, military conscription. Mennonites don't like this. So they send a delegate to the Tsar, and they say, we don't want to do this. Can we have an exception? And the Tsar says, no, you can't have an exception. This is nationwide. And by the way, you're not speaking Russian. You're speaking to us in German. We want you to learn Russian. And the Mennonites didn't like this. So about 20,000 of them move. They voluntarily leave. They voluntarily leave Russia for Canada. Well, North America, I could say, because some of them went to the United States, others went to Canada. And the ones that I'm following went to Canada. And they arrive in about 1874. They move to Saskatchewan. And here the Canadian government invites them as migrants, but also as Germans. And Germans are really good farmers, right? And they're Christians. And they're not only Christians, but they're also Protestants. Because we have this pesky group called the Quebecois, and they're Catholic and they're French-speaking, and they don't really get along with the Anglo majority. But these are nice Germans, and they'll probably learn English, and at least they're Protestants, so we invite them. And they're good farmers. So Canada invites them, they settle there. And this arrangement works for about 50 years until about 1920. And between 1914 and 1920, there's the First World War. Mennonites not, signing up to fight in the army, certainly. And also Canada wants compulsory public education, public school education in the English language. Once again, Mennonites don't like this. They talk to the Canadian government, they talk to the provincial government. There's this long sort of drawn out affair, whether they can stay. Some want to move to Mexico, and they do. Others hold out and go to Paraguay, because Paraguay will literally write into its constitution that the Mennonites don't have to, that the Mennonites don't have to fight in the army, and they can have their own schools. And they find this appealing, so about 2,000 move to Paraguay. And here they're welcomed as white settlers, because what's important by this point is their race, and also, right, they're these migrants from Canada that'll bring valuable farming skills. So here's a few pictures of them. This is during the early years, hauling water. I mean, it's pretty rugged conditions here in the Chaco. An early schoolhouse. By about 1935, you have, houses and gardens and so forth, but it is very difficult in this trying environment. Meanwhile, back in Russia, there's about 100,000 Mennonites living in the country by the time of the First World War. And during the war, Russia says, if you're German speaking, we're going to take your land, because Russia's fighting against Germany, and it's a land grab. And they do, except the Mennonites go to the Russian government. They say, actually, we're Dutch. Look at these old Bibles we have. Look at our last names. We're Dutch. Don't take our land. They get out of it. They can keep their land. Then in 1918, the German army invades the Mennonite colonies. And the Mennonites come out to the Germans and say, we're not really Dutch, we're Germans. And so they send a delegation to Berlin. They, talk to the German authorities. They let them keep their land. But then the Germans kind of back off. They sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is, doesn't include Mennonite colonies in German territory. And suddenly they find themselves back in Russian territory. But by this time, it isn't Russian territory, it's Soviet territory, because the Bolshevik Revolution happens in 1917. And they go to the Bolsheviks and say, well, we're Dutch, right? And the Soviets say, we don't care. What matters is how much money you have, and you have a lot of money. And so you're kulaks, and we're going to persecute you. And frankly, the idea of a kulak is kind of fabricated. It came down to the local mayor. You could be a kulak if you hired, the neighbor boy for seasonal labor, or I don't know, had a windmill. You could be a kulak if you were an alcoholic. You could be a kulak if you were a teetotaler. It just was a free-for-all. It was whoever the local officials didn't like. Well, anyway, a lot of local officials didn't like Mennonites, and they were forced to become refugees. And so a lot of them go to Moscow. Some of them threaten to kill themselves at the gates of the Kremlin if they're not allowed to leave. And Germany hears of their plight, and the German government says, "Oh my goodness, these people are Auslandsdeutsche." That means they're foreign Germans. They're Germans abroad, and they're refugees, and they've been labeled as kulaks, but they're not. They're great Germans. We should invite them in. And so they do. They bring about a few thousand to Germany. And then, 1929, the Great Depression hits in the fall, and suddenly Germany doesn't want refugees because these are more mouths to feed. And they don't really know what to do with them. And across the Atlantic, the MCC, the Mennonite Central Committee, hears of these refugees, and they quickly reform. They had been disbanded for about 4 years because the old Mennonite Church, didn't want to have big organizations tied to it. It just wanted to keep things small. Well, anyway, they reform, and Harold S. Bender is sort of at the front of that, and he's sent to Germany to talk with the refugees and learn about them. And so he goes over to Germany, and he says, he's 33 years old at the time. And he's trying to convince 2,000 refugees to do, they need their MCC's help, and he wants them to go to Paraguay because that's where these other Mennonites are. And he, in a letter, he later admitted to his friend Noah Euer, "Now you can imagine the sort of speech I made to the refugees in a language I do not master, on a subject of which I am ill-informed." But he wanted them to go to Paraguay because there's other Mennonites there. And the German government wanted them to go to Brazil because there's other Germans there. So there's this tension between Brazil and Germany over where they should go. Brazil and Paraguay. Finally, the MCC kind of wins out because the German government says, okay, you can handle these Mennonite refugees. And so about 2,000 end up going to Paraguay. A smaller number end up in Brazil. And it's my slide here. They are also welcomed as white settlers, which the racist government of Paraguay wants. And they settle alongside the Menno Colony. Others actually go to China from Serbia, not from Moscow, but from Serbia to China. And they make an appeal to the Canadian government to come to Canada. But the Canadians say, no, you can't come because you're Chinese. And they say, no, we're not. My name's Abe Harder or whatever. And no, you can't. You're coming from China, so you're Chinese. And you can't come in because you don't allow Chinese immigration. So they end up going to Paraguay too. And they land there in 1930. So within a few months of them settling there, and here's some pictures, in the Gran Chaco, Bolivia and Paraguay declare war on each other. And the Mennonites are right in the middle of this war zone. And the Fahrenheim Mennonites throw their sort of support behind the Paraguayan cause in ways to say thank you to them. The Menno Colony says, no, we're not interested, period, at all. Fahrenheim Colony's main street was actually strafed by bullets at one point. but Paraguay ended up winning in the end, and so it remained Paraguayan. Now, they're all here in Paraguay, and over the course of the next decade, like I said, they don't really communicate with each other. But during this time, about 90% of Fahrenheim's colonists at one point sort of drifted in the direction of supporting Germany's Nazi party, with the hope of either moving back to Germany or, after Germany declared war on the Soviet Union, to return to a German-controlled Ukraine, which is where they were from. And so, in the meantime, they squabbled amongst themselves, the Fernheimers. The Menno Colony sort of knew why they were there and what they wanted to do, but the Fernheimers squabbled amongst themselves over whether they owed allegiance to Paraguay, Nazi Germany, or to their Mennonitism, via the MCC. They also established a missionary organization called Light to the Indian in the attempt to convert the Chaco's indigenous population to Christianity. As always, right, as I said, the Menno Colony just sort of didn't want to have anything to do with any of these groups. And as we know, right, the Nazi regime came to naught in 1945, and MCC stepped up its mission work, and both colonies remain in the Chaco to this day. So in sum, the Menno Colony Mennonites rode a wave of nationalism to preserve their local autonomy. Right? Canada wanted to nationalize Western Canada, so the Mennonites came. Paraguay wants to nationalize the Chaco, so the Mennonites come again. But they want to preserve their local autonomy, while the Fahrenheim Colony traded on their ethnic, national, and religious identifications to save their lives and gain accommodations from both Mennonite and German allies. So I wanted a way to talk about, H.S. Bender visits the colony in 1939. He writes a glowing report in the Mennonite Quarterly Review about how great the Fahrenheim Colony is doing, but this is sort of at the height of its drift to Nazism. This is a picture of Hitler right there. And that's a swastika garden. I don't know if these artifacts were on display when Bender with the MCC was there, but the sentiment was certainly in the air. And so one wonders how exactly he interpreted that. But I wanted a way to talk about how both groups understood their movements and how they were identifying themselves, because it feels pretty schizophrenic when you, like, first they're this, then they're that, and they're here, and they're there. So I thought the most effective way to do this was to look at the stories that they used to interpret their movements and their identifications, and how they understood themselves as actors in larger, unfolding religious and national mythologies. And what I discovered is that the voluntary migrants of Menno Colony and the refugees of Fahrenheim articulated very different ideas about the trajectories and roles of their communities in the world. And these ideas can be mapped as plot progressions. So go to this here. So the Menno Colony thought of their movements as a series of comic plot progressions. And a comic plot progression takes the narrative shape of a U. Right? Things are fine, there's a crisis, and then there's a happy ending. Just think of any movie, right? There's a problem in the middle, and then by the end, it's okay. In Shakespeare, it usually ends with a marriage, right? And in their writings, the Menno Colony drew on biblical stories to interpret their movements, from Israelites wandering the desert for 40 years, to Jesus wandering in the wilderness for 40 days. Right? These stories resonated with the Menno Colony. So they have a moment of trial and renewal, and in each place they're sort of restored. And so a move it's a big deal, but it's not a big deal because you're following the path of others that had moved there, to where you are now, Russia to Canada, Canada to Paraguay. And incidentally, too, the Menno Colony also played a role in emerging Russian, Canadian, and Paraguayan nationalist narratives about the trials of integrating land and people into the national fabric. And they kind of have a similar narrative too, right? We're going to have this happy conclusion of nationalized land and nationalized populations. When Canada, reaches its full potential, we'll all be Canadians. So the Menno Colony aligned with these narratives for a while. They both wanting to colonize this space and create something of it. But eventually the Menno Colony sort of departs and they follow their own story to another place in the world. Now, alternately, the Fahrenheim Colony understood themselves trapped in a tragic plot progression. And a tragic plot takes the narrative shape of a U, or an inverted U, rather, like this. These Mennonites truly believed that Russia was their biblical promised land, and their settlement was really the end of the story. They're going to stay here forever. This is it. But when they fled to Germany, they were forced to reconsider this notion. So kind of move like this, because they're not quite sure what's happening. Maybe Germany is where they're supposed to end up. So they don't really know. It's kind of a little bit of a U. Maybe we'll be restored here in Germany. After all, we had lived in, the German-speaking lands 200 years ago, so maybe we're just going back. But these Mennonites were sent to Paraguay. And this was not on their mental map. This truly was a tragedy because they didn't see it coming. And so they had to be really creative about how they were interpreting their story via the Bible. And, the Menno Colony didn't have this kind of creativity. They had a plot. So they didn't know where the story would end. They thought perhaps we will be called back to Russia. Maybe we'll end up going back to Russia when the Nazis, by the hand of God, restore our land to us. And they thought, well, maybe God's called us to Paraguay. Maybe we should be in Paraguay for some reason. I don't know. Maybe we should proselytize to indigenous people. And they do, right? That now becomes part of a possible story. Or maybe God's left us. And you get a lot of cynicism in the colony newspaper, Menno. Maybe God's abandoned us. We did something wrong here. And so some of them leave. They go to try and go to Canada or Ascension or other places. And also, too, these Mennonites are fitting in with an emerging Nazi plot. And because Germany believed that they were, the Nazis believed that German pride was wounded in World War I, and now the Nazis are going to restore them to their full potential and their greatness. They're going to march to the east. They're going to take over Eastern Europe and Russia, and this will be a happy German paradise. And so the Fahrenheim colonists sort of merge with that narrative trajectory because they're both seeing eye to eye. So the MCC, for its part, conceived of itself as part of an entirely different story, an entirely new story, a story of transnational Mennonite solidarity. They believed that the Anabaptists had been lulled to sleep as Mennonites. They had become the quiet in the land. And now it was time to rejuvenate this dormant Anabaptist vision. And Harold S. Bender writes a book, The Anabaptist Vision. And to go out in the world, and now not just really, on a local level, having this local Mennonite unity. Now we need to be globally unified as Mennonites. And so they start to sort of reinterpret the Mennonite story of separation of church and state. It's sort of equal to sort of democratic tenets of separation of church and state. And democracy is kind of similar to like choosing to become a Christian. And so the MCC leaders sort of see themselves almost creating a Mennonite nation in a sense, a transnational, a globally connected Mennonite nation. And it was really a story of progress. So each group held very, very different, I haven't advanced my last one there, held very different understandings of their role in the world and the trajectory of history based on the way they constructed or attempted to construct their group narratives. And this, of course, led to a great deal of dissonance. None of these groups really got along between 1930 and 1945. But even though these groups were like three metronomes, each moving at a different speed, they eventually came into line after World War II, when a new group of refugees, composed mostly of women and children, arrived in the Chaco from Europe. And the MCC in both colonies kind of chipped in to help this new group of settlers, and they all continue to have a relationship to this day. So here are just a few of those pictures again, the Menno Colony, the Fahrenheim Colony, and there is a picture of the indigenous people, the mission, and then Bender's visit again in 1930. And you can see, it's starting to look pretty good by 1939. They have some actual buildings and houses. So to go over just my arguments just one more time, Russia's Mennonites are using nationalism and ecumenicism to get things, and governments are using migrants and refugees to get things. They're different things, but they're in relationships. Now, what is important about all of this beyond just an interesting narrative about Mennonites during a very interesting time of world history? Well, I think the book speaks to our understanding of nationalism and religious ecumenicism. In the past decade, a lot of historians and social scientists have started to treat the phenomenon of nationality more as an event rather than as a permanent, unchanging condition of reality. And what I mean by this is that nations and other large groups have moments of groupness, moments of feeling connected, specific times when populations experience a collective national, ethnic, or religious solidarity. At other times, it might not be that important. So September 10th, 2001. Ask 800 people, what's most important to you about who you are? Not a lot would say American. September 12th, 2001. How many would say American? I'm an American. That was a moment of groupness, a moment when a lot of people in this country felt American together. So I have moments of groupness, times when people are coming together to say, we're Mennonite, we're leaving, or we're German, whatever. And it's an interesting concept, but the question remains how these moments fit together, right? And so my work shows how these moments connect to each other across time as a narrative. And I argue that these moments of collective solidarity are plot points in larger mythologies. And I connect those across 50 years and 4 continents. My second intervention, or big takeaway, I think, from the book concerns German history and Germans abroad, of which there are a lot. There are a lot of German immigrants in the 16, 17, 1800s. And most books on German speakers abroad tend to treat these individuals as a block of Germans who happen to live outside Germany in another country, like Russian Germans or German Americans. And they're not really blocks because these German speakers hold a lot of different identifications: religious, cultural, class, linguistic, country of origin. In other words, Germanness is a part of local communities. They are not necessarily a part of Germany. After all, there have been 6 different German governments from 1871 to the present. There's, German Empire, there's Weimar Germany, there's Nazi Germany, there's East Germany, there's West Germany, and there's present-day Germany, each with its own idea of what being a German is. So I argue that even when diasporic communities or migrant communities do align with the Germanness articulated by the German government, it's mostly done for their own reasons and not for the betterment of a German homeland. And finally, my work intervenes in literature on refugees. And by and large, much of the language on refugees is framed by the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. That's where we get our modern understanding of refugees. And it's very policy-oriented, presentist, and it really treats migrants and refugees as sort of a temporary problem that's amenable to a solution. But there's really no such thing as a refugee crisis. We live in a world of nation states where a nation should align with a government, should align with a territory. That's kind of unusual. It's very idealistic. In that world where lines butt up against each other perfectly across the globe, there's always going to be people left out. There will always be refugee crises in a world of nation states. That's just kind of a fact. So they're not a problem so much as an asset for people that are in power. They can make claims about the refugees, right? We're a country that accepts refugees. We're a nice country. We're a country that rejects refugees. We think that they hurt us. So they're actually, in a sense, a rhetorical asset for powerful people. And they also, right, as I say here, they teach the nation what it is. Who are we? Well, we can define ourselves against or for these refugees. Right. My work also demonstrates that migrants and refugees have religious interpretations of their movement. I think that often gets overlooked. We're mostly focused on their political affiliations or their economic conditions. So, you know, similar to like when you say Syrian refugees, well, what are Syrian refugees? The assumption is they're Muslim, they came directly from Syria. Well, they could have been in Jordan for a decade. They could be Christian. They could be of all economic classes, all kinds of levels of education. It's hard to just say Syrian refugee and know what this person is. And finally, all of the organizations that appear in my book, from the MCC to the Nazis to the Paraguayan government, profoundly misunderstood the Mennonite colonies because they had an abstract picture of them. And this is a fundamental problem of our modern world. Graphs, charts, citizenship applications, forms, all of these things turn real people into numbers. And when people become numbers, we stop seeing their reality and even sometimes their humanity. They become an asset or a liability. And I think helping people on a large scale is certainly possible in our world. I don't want to say it's not possible, but we may never really understand what we're doing or exactly how we're helping. And so at the broadest level, my research uses a small group of Mennonites to show how a lot of mobile populations respond to the twin developments of nationalism and religious ecumenicism during the modern era. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I'd like to open the floor to any questions.
John,
yeah.
When you get a question, please repeat it so that folks on Zoom can.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay. Questions?
Yeah, question.
I'm just curious about the fact that there Fernheim had a Nazism, but you also had this interest in evangelizing the indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
That's not normally what you put together when you think about Nazism.
Right.
So how does that interface?
Right. So the question is, how do you have a group of Mennonites supporting both Nazism and indigenous people, with the implication being that the Nazis' racist hierarchy would put indigenous people way below. And yeah. Okay. Well, I think the bonds between the Nazis in Germany and Paraguay were very loose. This is before their communication comes across an ocean, up a river, a narrow gauge track, and walking into the bush. So there's not a lot of communication, and there's not a terribly. I have the sense that Fahrenheimers had a sense of the news and what was going on and what the Nazis were about. I don't want to let them off the hook. I think they knew what the Nazis were about in their racism, but they also made their own decisions. It wasn't just this lockstep, now we're Nazis. They saw their connection to Nazi Germany as strategic. It would help them leave. There's not a lot of payoff in just being a racist. There is a payoff in having a big, powerful country recognize you and be maybe thinking about bringing you to live in it. So they're very pragmatic. And the Nazis that do come to visit the colonies notice this, and they say, these people aren't real Nazis. They just want to kind of use us. They want us to help them and bring us back to Germany, bring them back to Germany. And so they're called, I think, pharisaical, by one such Nazi. And the Fernheimers totally disagree. They say they're really good Germans. So that's, yeah.
So is the common linkage kind of a pan-German identity?
The linkage, yeah, what is German? Yeah. At the end of the day, what is German? And the Nazis never really squared the circle, and no one really has, because at the end of the day, there's nothing racial behind it. It's language, it's culture, customs to some degree. But even then, you have dialects that are totally unintelligible to each other, German dialects. So, and in South America, you have Jewish Germans in South America. You have people that left when it was still a king, an empire, and they have no interest in Nazism. A lot of artists and intellectuals that fled. So it's a really heterogeneous group of German speakers in Latin America. It's like herding cats. Can't do it.
know this is beyond on the scope of the book, but what's happening to these two groups today? I mean, the two different colonies. They still not talking, or are they talking, or just curious, just briefly, a quick.
Yeah, the question is, how are these colonies interacting today? What's their status, the relationship between them? And there's others in this room that probably know this answer better than I do, and certainly online, I imagine. But my understanding is that they do cooperate. They get along. There's communication. I would imagine there's even intermarriage. What I learned just this evening from Edgar Stace is that now they can even joke about how they used to sort of be antagonistic toward each other. But I imagine the memory of that division is still there. But I think it's pretty healed by now.
How did the folks in Menno Colony understand Germanness? So I think there's, we've heard some of the different interpretations for Fahrenheim. For Menno, I mean, you talked about they want to leave Canada because they want to have German schooling, but what else does it mean to be German for people in Menno? Yeah, so the question is, what does it mean to be German for Menno Colony, because they kind of reject an association with the German nation state. To be German in Menno Colony was to speak, I think, their Low German dialect and have school in that language. Saying you're very specifically sort of Low German by way of, the Dutch and then Danzig and then, it's very confusing. So when they're communicating with governments, they let it be known that they're German in sort of this generic way. And they know that means something to governments, because governments like German immigrants, especially before there's a German nation state, before the country of Germany in 1871. That means there's no big brother standing behind these immigrants saying you better treat them right. They're just German-speaking immigrants. And so they welcome them as German farmers. And the Menno Colony, for their part, don't articulate any sort of nationalist Germany or Germanness. It's all just defined very much at the local level, what they read, what they speak. And Nazism has no appeal to them, just none whatsoever. Yeah.
I have another question, sort of a comment and then related to that as a question, but it strikes me that this is a really complicated study, because you're dealing with people in all these different countries and settings, and they're moving all the time. So it's not as simple as just focusing on one community and one state. So I admire you tackling it because of its complexity. And related to that is, what primary sources were available to you, or what, when you talk about the mythology and so on, what kind of primary sources did you have to piece that together? Right.
The first comment was a compliment, so thank you, and I'll move on. The second question was, or comment concerned my sources. My primary sources, because they're located on several different continents, because these groups are moving around a lot. And so a lot of my primary sources for this project, well, I relied on newspapers a lot, like Menoblatt, in the Fahrenheim Colony newspaper called Menoblatt. And they did a pretty good, it was a monthly newspaper. And they also, to some degree, mentioned things about the Menno Colony. Also, there are some conservative Mennonite newspapers in Canada that the Menno Colony would subscribe to, but then also write to. And so I could pick up some things on the radar from Menno Colony that way. I also visited both colonies and looked at their archives. The interesting thing about the Fahrenheim Colony there is that a lot of it has to do in this period, of course, with the question of Nazism and talking about it. The Menno Colony, the amount of time they spent thinking about, I think there was one reference in one sermon. So they're just not caring. So archives, newspapers. In Germany, I went to the Foreign Office, and they had a lot of correspondences, both between the Russian government and the Canadian government during 1929, but also between Mennonites in Paraguay and the German government. There's a collection too in England that I consulted, and also in Canada, the Mennonite Heritage Center up there. So, and then also in Bethel, I went to Bethel College because they have an archive. That's sort of from the MCC perspective, their records. And also the MCC archive, so it used to be in Indiana, now it's here in Pennsylvania. And so the MCC documents, so sort of piecing that together. Yeah.
The Mennonites were at Fahrenheim, and the Mennonites were in Menno Colony. In Russia, there's different Mennonite groups.
Mm-hmm.
And so are these coming, I guess the question is, what kind of Mennonites are they? Is Fahrenheim Mennonite Brethren? And of course, there were those kinds of divisions and so on in Russia, and then moving to Canada and so on, different kinds of communities. Did that play at all into the fact that these two colonies didn't really connect?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, there are a lot of different Mennonite groups, both in Russia and then also in Canada. There's a lot of splinter groups. So did these previous divisions play themselves out in any particular way in Paraguay once they're there? Well, the refugees are just sort of a random assembly of anyone who could make it to Moscow first and then to Germany. So you have Mennonite Brethren, you have two Alliance Mennonites, and then the other group. I wrote this book a long time ago, I'm sorry. I've forgotten the third group, but there are three groups, the main groups in Russia. And the MBs are the sort of the most oriented towards the Nazi group. And they're also very interested, or towards Nazism, but they're also very compliant, very interested in working with MCC too, and also the outreach to the indigenous people. The Alliance Mennonites are against Nazism very firmly. And they had always been sort of a splinter group even back in Russia. And that kind of already sort of set them against, I think, the mainstream of that. The Meno Colony are Sommerfelders and I forget the other group, Bergthaler, but I think there are several splinter groups in Canada in the 1870s, so or in the 1920s. So they're composed of a couple of groups too, and there you have a situation where I think the smaller group owned most of the land or resource, the money, and the bigger group had less. And so their big tension in the 1930s was over this land issue. They're not really paying attention to anything else other than this land issue that's going on. And so, yeah, these divisions played themselves out, very clearly in the colonies.
How did they acquire the land? Was it granted to them by the Paraguayan government, or did they buy it? Or, you mentioned a couple of times they were welcome as farmers.
Right. The question is, who owns the land in Paraguay and how did the Mennonites acquire it? Well, the land was owned by Jose Casado, who was the largest landowner, I think at that time, in the world. And he wasn't Paraguayan, he was Argentinian. And the Mennonites, are coming from Europe, and the MCCs from the United States. So Paraguay ostensibly owns the land. They don't really, it's in dispute with Bolivia. So they're saying they own it because they happen to have the closest military, but really it's a Argentinian landowner. It's two refugees from Europe and an organization from North America that are calling all the shots. So you can see just how weak the government, I mean, when you look at like Paraguay, oh, it's a, there are lines around it. They must administer this. No, they didn't. They didn't know what was going on really at all. Much less Bolivia. And Bolivia thinks that it administers the Chaco too. And there's a funny little incident. The refugees are leaving from Le Havre, port of Le Havre, and a Bolivian consulate runs on board right when it's leaving and stops it all because he says, you cannot go to the Chaco. Paraguay can't let you do that. You have to have a Bolivian stamp. So he went around the whole boat stamping everyone's passport, Nansen refugee passport, as being approved by Bolivia. But they didn't. No one could administer the Chaco. So it's Casado that owns it. Eventually, the Menno colonists buy it from Casado. MCC steps in and buys land for the Fahrenheim colonists. And eventually the MCC buys the Meno colony land too. So the debt's consolidated under MCC. And MCC now is the biggest landowner in Paraguay for a while and has a lot of debt. And so the Fahrenheim Mennonites, or the Meno colony Mennonites can, I think, pay their debts. The Fahrenheim colony can't. And so you look at it from the Fahrenheim colony perspective, you have MCC, they speak English, they're Americans, and they're demanding money from us. And then you have Nazi Germany, and they want to give us stuff because they donated a bunch of stuff. And they're big and they're powerful, and they say we can go back to Germany. Like when you line these two up materially, I mean, not spiritually, right? But materially, like the scales are moving a little more towards Germany. But World War II kind of resolves all that. And then MCC gets a lot of money after the war. And then it's very clear that the MCC is in control of the situation. But for a while, it's pretty dicey. And a lot of Fahrenheimers don't want to pay the debt because they're like, we're leaving for Germany anyway. Right? We're going out.
But they never do.
But they never do. They never do go back to Germany. No. A couple of them did as students. Move back. You can see them all. From the Paraguayan perspective, like the fact that they're white is really good. The fact that they're German is good because Germans are always associated with being good agriculturalists. There is some tension over the fact that they're Mennonite and Protestant because Paraguay is a Catholic country. And there is, in the conservative press in Paraguay, before the Meno colony comes, there's a lot of debate and some tension over the fact that these German-speaking white Protestants are basically in control of the northern third of our country, and we don't know what's going on up there. And so that is a point of tension. But after the Chaco War, and average Paraguayans see that the Mennonites helped their troops, then I think everything is okay. And I don't know the indigenous side, what the indigenous people, because there were Jesuit missionaries also operating up there, especially before the Chaco War. And actually, I do believe that they liked the Meno missionaries better. They were less harsh, I think, than the Jesuits, at least with some of the tribes. And there's a book by Renee Harder-Horst on the indigenous perception of that. But yeah, the identifications are less significant, I think. And the Paraguayans are never really concerned that they're Nazi Germans, because a lot of Paraguayans kind of thought fascism was neat. Stroessner, who was the dictator at the time, was kind of a fascist. So that didn't really matter too much to them. The American military, though, they come in and they're like, whoa, a lot of Nazis here, and they start rounding up. They start rounding up Germans, like it's not even their jurisdiction, but they round them up, or they compel the Paraguayans to round them up and put them in camps, internment camps or whatever. All sorts of Germans. And really throughout Latin America, the United States rounded up, like told countries to find your Germans, round them up, and put them in camps. And they got their way. Colombia, other places. Sorry, was there a question?
Yes. What was the Chaco War all about?
Yeah. So the question is about the Chaco War and what happened. There had always been a land dispute there because no Spanish-speaking Paraguayans or Bolivians really wanted to go there. It was considered pretty worthless land, but they knew that there might be some potential there someday. So, while there's open land, make a border, right? Grab it. And so there had been a dispute there for 10, 20, 30 years. It had been arbitrated at various points, I think even by an American president. I could be wrong there. But there had been arbitration, maybe with the League of Nations. It just disintegrated though in 1932. It was sort of a tit for tat situation. I think the Paraguayans might have overrun a Bolivian outpost, and that was enough pretext that either side needed to just declare war. So
Oil.
that was the idea. I think Standard Oil maybe had gone in and investigated and found there wasn't really oil, but that was kind of part of the pretext. There might be. That was kind of the given, I think, natural source reason. I kind of think it was just to make a border. I think we just need to, they needed to know who has it.
Any questions? Did your book look at all about the MCCs involved? And do you look at all about how MCC understands Mennonite?
Mm-hmm.
That they're working with these people.
Mm-hmm.
MCC is an American organization. How do they understand these folks? What's that? That's always been the thing I've been trying to understand about MCC in the early years. What does it mean to be Mennonite?
So the question is, what does it mean to be Mennonite from the MCC's perspective? The MCC has an idea that there are Mennonites in the world and they're unified by something. And they don't really know because they go to different or hear of different Mennonites around the world. And in fact, they go and visit even some. There's a situation in which, this is before the MCC, but some of its leaders heard about suffering Mennonites in the Chaco from, I think, a newspaper here in this area in Lancaster. And so they talked to another missionary who's in Latin America already, or in Paraguay. I think it was Brazil or Argentina. And they go to the Chaco and they're, who are these Menno Colony Mennonites? It's like 1928. Who are these Menno Colony Mennonites? They're boring. Their church services go on for ages. They just sit and read sermons. They don't even sing. It's just sort of this eye-opening, like, I can't believe these could be Mennonites. And there's an interest, I think, especially with Harold S. Bender, in trying to figure out who they are at this time. While they're doing this, they're also trying to figure out who they are. And I think the problem is very immediate for them because in World War I, they didn't know who they were. They couldn't communicate who they were to the government. The Amish couldn't, the Mennonites couldn't. And they look at the Quakers, and the Quakers can. And the Quakers are able to sort of navigate their ship through the turbulent waters of World War I. And the Mennonites have big problems. They're locked up, they're imprisoned, some of the young men. And so after World War I, there's a very immediate reason to say, we need to become legible to governments. We need governments, bullet points. Here's what we are. We do this, 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 this. We're nonviolent, simplicity, et cetera, et cetera. And then coming out of that, I think, is where you get this growth of Mennonite scholarship in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s that really try and figure out what the Mennonites are, which is weird because the Mennonites aren't Catholic and the Catholics do that, right? They have, clear ideas. This is Catholicism, right? There's the Vatican and there's this hierarchy and this is structure, right? It's very legible to governments what Catholicism is. And the Mennonites don't have that and they build it. They try and do it. And so when they encounter Mennonites like from Russia, and they don't care too much about, Russian Mennonites in the 1930s had lived through World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, dekulakization. These are not pacifist Mennonites. They've lived through war for 15 years. And so when MCC confronts that, they don't really know what to do because they'd just been telling the US government that they're, non-resistant. you know. And so I don't even know if that is sorted out. I don't know what the official thing is. I don't know if there is one, but they're really trying to find one. The MCC and especially Harold S. Bender is really trying to figure that out in the 30s and the 40s. And that's where you get this narrative of, you know, like we were great in the 1500s and then we're kind of lost and now we're rediscovering ourselves kind of as a nation. It's sort of Mennonite nationalism in a sense. So, yeah.
But it seems also, though, to be some kind of, even though there's this articulation of ideas, there also seems to be some kind of ethnicity definition. These people are Mennonite is an ethnicity. So even if it doesn't fit into the idea, so they're no longer pastors. Yeah. But it still has an ethnic element to it.
Yeah, the question is there an ethnic element to the Mennonite, to being Mennonite? And from what I read, I didn't get the sense that the early MCC was expressing any sort of Mennonite ethnicity. I kind of think it wasn't ever a question because at that time, most Mennonites had come out of some sort of German-speaking background, definitely were white, had a variety of shared names. I don't even think the question was on their radar over whether it's an ethnicity or not, as a distinct sort of, I don't know if that didn't even come, and I'm out of my league here, but that was maybe more of a post-war question of ethnicity. In Germany, I think though, and definitely in Germany, they were German first and Mennonite, you know, both. In that country, you were German and you were Mennonite. The ethnicity was German. So.
It wasn't more of a historical identity.
Yeah.
Rather than ethnic, it was the sense that, well, we come from the same womb, yeah, so to speak, historically, and so we're family. Right. Yeah, so historically. Yeah, the point was rather than ethnicity, maybe it was history that they shared. And yes, I think the sense that they all came out of the Anabaptist movement. And that's why I think Anabaptism really looms large in a lot of Mennonite scholarship in the 20s and 30s to try and underscore that common origin story, not so much the story of them, you know, separating out into a million different sub branches. And now coming back together, right? We're going to be unified. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. We need to wrap our time this evening, but I want to thank you for sharing. Thank you for joining us. And for those of you here and those of you still joining us via the live stream, remind you that in just less than a month from now, on Tuesday, November 16, you can join us either here or join us online for our fall Snowden lecture. Dr. Rosalind Byler of the University of Central Florida will be exploring with us her research on communication networks and migration again, but from a different time period, 17th and 18th century transatlantic migration among Anabaptists, Pietists, and Quakers, and the way in which through communication that they learn about each other, learn about places that they could connect, and ways of travel and creating new communities elsewhere. Crossing political and cultural and linguistic borders, and how these relationships shaped migration opportunities within Europe and here in Pennsylvania. So that will be on Tuesday, November 16 at 7 p.m., Dr. Rosalind Byler for the Young Center's Fall Snowden Lecture. Special thanks this evening from our IT support staff who made this program possible, and thanks to Elizabethtown College for its support of the Young Center. Have a good evening, safe travels as you return home.